You've felt it before, the chilling sense that something is lurking just beyond the corner of your eye. What if it's not your imagination? The shadow people phenomenon dives into real-life encounters with these dark, mysterious figures seen across the world. Are they watching you right now? Discover the terrifying truth behind these shadowy entities that haunt the night before they find you. Chapter 1. A Glimpse in the Night. First Encounters. It begins, as many horrors do, in the dead of night. For centuries, people have woken from their slumber to find themselves not alone in their rooms. The accounts, though spread across time and space, share eerie commonalities. Dark figures lurking in corners, standing at the foot of beds, or slipping into the shadows as soon as they are noticed. These shadow people, as they've come to be known, leave a lasting impression not only on the room they haunt, but on the lives of those who encounter them. In 2001, a man in North Carolina woke up suddenly, his body rigid, his heart pounding in his chest. His eyes darted across the room, searching for the cause of the suffocating dread that had seized him. Then he saw it, a tall, black silhouette standing in the corner, unmoving yet undeniably there. The figure had no discernible features, just the outline of a human form, darker than the blackness of the night. Panic flooded his veins. He blinked, hoping it was a trick of his tired eyes. But when his lids lifted, the shadow had not disappeared. It remained, observing him, silent and motionless. The man later recounted how he felt paralyzed, not by any physical force, but by pure fear. His instincts screamed at him to flee, to scream, to do anything, but his body refused to comply. He lay frozen, eyes locked on the figure until, without warning, it glided backwards into the wall, melting into the darkness as if it had never been there. But it had been, and its presence lingered long after it had gone. The experience left him shaken, sleepless, and filled with a deep, unshakable sense that something unnatural had crossed the threshold of his home that night. This experience is far from isolated. Thousands of similar encounters have been reported worldwide, spanning decades, cultures, and age groups. From Mexico to Japan, from rural villages to bustling cities, people have reported seeing shadowy figures, often during the night, always evoking a primal, bone-deep fear. In the 1970s, a family in England experienced a string of strange sightings. One evening, the eldest daughter, just 14 at the time, was lying in bed when she saw what she initially thought was a person standing by her bedroom door. But something was wrong. The figure had no features, no face, just the shape of a person, as if someone had cut a human-shaped hole in the fabric of reality. She screamed for her parents, but by the time they arrived, the figure had vanished. What followed were months of restless nights. The shadow figure continued to appear, not just to her, but to her younger brother as well. They described the same unnerving experience. The figure never moved aggressively. It didn't approach them, but its mere presence filled the room with a suffocating sense of evil. It stood there, watching, its form always shifting slightly, as if made of smoke or liquid darkness. Shadow people, it seems, prefer to stay just out of reach, just out of focus. Their evasiveness only adds to the terror, the uncertainty of what, exactly, has invaded the space you once felt safe in. One of the earliest recorded encounters with shadow people comes from a German diary dating back to the 1600s. A man wrote about waking in the middle of the night to find his bedroom filled with shadowy figures, standing in silence at the foot of his bed. Terrified, he reached for the candle on his nightstand, only for his trembling hands to knock it over, plunging the room into deeper darkness. When he finally relit the flame, the figures had vanished, but the dread remained. He wrote of feeling as though the very air had been poisoned by their presence. It was as if they were not of this world, but visitors from a place devoid of light, of life. What makes shadow people so unnerving is not just their appearance, but the overwhelming sense of malice that accompanies them. Witnesses frequently report that the figures seem to radiate an aura of evil, as if their very existence is tied to something far darker than mere apparitions. These encounters are not just about seeing something strange. They are about feeling it, sensing its malevolent intent deep within the pit of your stomach. In the late 1990s, a woman in California experienced a string of visits from a shadowy figure that would appear at the foot of her bed. Each time, it would get closer. At first, it stood at a distance, almost hesitant. But as the nights wore on, it began to lean over her, closer and closer, until she could feel the cold, suffocating presence just inches from her face. She described it as the feeling of being buried alive, unable to breathe, unable to move, as though the air itself had turned to cement. She eventually moved out of her home, convinced that whatever this entity was, it had latched onto her, waiting for something, though she couldn't say what. Across the globe, similar stories unfold, each one unique yet familiar. A man in Brazil sees a shadow dart across his living room just as he is about to fall asleep. A young boy in Australia watches as a dark figure slips through his bedroom door and vanishes into thin air. A woman in Russia is chased by a shadow person, its long limbs reaching out to grab her, only for it to dissolve the moment she screams. The phenomenon of shadow people is as elusive as it is terrifying. They appear in glimpses, often in the periphery of our vision, just enough to remind us that perhaps we are not as alone in the dark as we would like to believe. They vanish without a trace, leaving behind nothing but a cold, creeping dread and the unsettling certainty that they will return. For those who have seen them, there is no need for explanations. The experience alone is enough to chill the blood. The shadows have been with us for centuries, slipping in and out of our world, watching, waiting, always there, just beyond the light. Chapter 2. The Hat Man, dark figures with distinct features. He watches from the shadows, silent and looming, with a wide-brimmed hat casting a sinister silhouette over his featureless face. The Hat Man, a figure as terrifying as he is mysterious, has been sighted around the world, leaving fear and unease in his wake. Unlike the more ambiguous forms of shadow people, the Hat Man is distinct, his ominous presence marked by the chilling detail of his hat. From the United States to Germany, from South Africa to Brazil, the descriptions are eerily consistent, and his appearances are far from fleeting. For those who encounter him, the Hat Man is unforgettable. One of the earliest known encounters with the Hat Man was documented in the 1960s in a small town in southern Germany. A young boy, no more than 10 years old, awoke to find a figure standing in his bedroom doorway. At first, he thought it was his father, silhouetted against the dim hallway light. But something was off. The figure was too tall, its body too rigid. As the boy's eyes adjusted to the darkness, he noticed the wide-brimmed hat, and a chill ran down his spine. He tried to call out, but no sound escaped his mouth. The figure didn't move, but its presence filled the room with a suffocating sense of dread. He pulled the covers over his head, praying for the figure to leave. When he finally peeked out again, the doorway was empty, but the fear remained, gnawing at him for years. He would later tell his story to a researcher of paranormal phenomena, describing the Hat Man with unnerving clarity decades after the encounter. This figure, this shadow with a hat, has no nationality, no cultural boundary. In the 1980s, a woman in Alabama had a nearly identical experience. She woke in the middle of the night, feeling as if someone was watching her. The room was dark, but there, standing at the foot of her bed, was a tall figure wearing what she could only describe as a fedora. The room felt colder, as though the very air had been drained of warmth. Like so many others, she was paralyzed with fear, unable to scream or move, her eyes locked on the shadowy man with the hat. She described feeling as if the Hat Man was studying her, not with eyes. He had none, but with a palpable, oppressive awareness. After what felt like an eternity, the figure slowly turned and walked out of the room, disappearing into the shadows of the hallway. She never saw him again, but the encounter haunted her dreams for years. The Hat Man seems to materialize in the most unexpected of places. In 2010, a security guard working the night shift at a hospital in São Paulo, Brazil, reported an encounter that left him shaken. He was making his rounds in a wing of the hospital that was under renovation, dimly lit and quiet. As he turned a corner, he froze, Standing at the far end of the hallway was a tall figure dressed in a long coat and wearing a wide-brimmed hat. The figure's form was indistinct, like a shadow that had peeled itself off the wall and taken shape. The guard called out, assuming it was a person who had wandered into the restricted area. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it began to glide slowly, smoothly, down the hallway toward him. Panicked, the guard reached for his radio, but his hands were trembling so violently he dropped it. When he looked back up, the figure had vanished, as if it had melted into the very walls of the hospital. Such encounters are far from rare. In 2015, a man in Australia was reading late into the night when he noticed movement out of the corner of his eye. Turning, he saw a dark figure standing just outside the open door of his bedroom. The figure was tall, and its most striking feature was a wide-brimmed hat that obscured its upper body, making it impossible to discern any other details. The man felt an overwhelming sense of dread and unease, as if the figure was not just watching him, but invading his thoughts, his very soul. He blinked, and the figure was gone. But the feeling of being watched lingered for hours, making sleep impossible. In the weeks that followed, the man became increasingly paranoid, convinced the Hat Man would return. What makes the Hat Man particularly terrifying is not just his appearance, but the sense of malevolence that accompanies him. Witnesses often report feeling as though the Hat Man is not just an observer, but an entity with an almost predatory intent. Some describe his presence as evil. Others say he feels like a harbinger of doom. In 2003, a woman in South Africa experienced repeated sightings of the Hat Man over the course of several months. Each time, the figure appeared at the foot of her bed, watching her in silence. She would wake up, paralyzed with fear, unable to move or scream. The figure never approached her, but the weight of his presence pressed down on her chest, making it difficult to breathe. She described the experience as suffocating, as though the Hat Man was feeding off her fear. After months of sleepless nights, she moved out of her home, unable to bear his presence any longer. The consistency of these sightings is what sets the Hat Man apart from other paranormal phenomena. Unlike more ambiguous shadow people, the Hat Man's form is distinct and recognizable. His wide-brimmed hat and tall, looming figure are described with such similarity across cultures and continents that it's difficult to dismiss these accounts as mere imagination or hallucination. Even more unsettling is the fact that many who encounter the Hat Man have no prior knowledge of him. They are unaware that others have seen the same figure until they begin searching for answers, only to find they are not alone. For decades, people have reported seeing this shadowy figure with a hat, always accompanied by an overwhelming sense of dread. He appears in dreams, in waking moments, in the dark corners of bedrooms, and the dim hallways of hospitals. He does not speak, he does not move quickly, but his presence is undeniable, leaving those who encounter him with a lingering, primal fear that they can never quite shake. Who or what the Hat Man is remains a mystery. But one thing is certain, he is not a figment of imagination. The global consistency of these sightings suggests something far more sinister. And for those who have seen him, his wide-brimmed hat will forever be etched into the darkest corners of their memory. Chapter 3. Sleep paralysis or something more? Imagine waking in the dead of night, your eyes open but your body frozen, as if held down by an invisible force. The room is suffocatingly still, every sound exaggerated in the eerie silence. You try to move, to scream, but nothing happens. And then, in the corner of your vision, a figure appears, black, shifting, faceless. It moves toward you, slowly, deliberately, as if savoring your helplessness. This is sleep paralysis, a phenomenon as old as time itself. And for many, it's far more than just a quirk of the mind. For centuries, cultures around the world have described shadowy figures that appear during these episodes of paralysis, often with malevolent intent. Modern science explains sleep paralysis as a condition where the mind wakes, but the body remains in a state of paralysis, the borders between dream and reality blurred. Yet for those who have lived through it, the figures they see, dark, looming entities, are too real, too terrifying, to be dismissed as hallucinations. In 2005, a woman in Texas woke to find herself unable to move. The room around her was dark, the only sound the faint hum of her ceiling fan. Panic set in as she realized she couldn't shift her limbs or even turn her head. Then, from the corner of her eye, she saw a shape, a tall, black figure standing in the corner of her bedroom. It was a shadow, darker than the night, and it seemed to pulsate with a slow, menacing energy. She wanted to scream, but her throat refused to cooperate. The figure moved, not walking but gliding, until it stood directly over her. It had no face, no eyes, yet she felt it staring into her. The weight of its presence was unbearable, pressing down on her chest like a physical force. She lay there, trapped, unable to do anything but silently beg for it to leave. After what felt like hours, the figure vanished. She regained control of her body, but the terror lingered long after the shadow was gone. This type of experience is not unique. In fact, countless people across the globe have reported similar encounters during episodes of sleep paralysis. The phenomenon often begins the same way, waking in the middle of the night, completely paralyzed, with a heavy, foreboding presence filling the room. One of the most chilling accounts comes from a man in Japan, who in 2012 described a series of sleep paralysis episodes that haunted him for months. Each time, he would wake up utterly immobilized, with the overwhelming sensation that something was watching him. At first, he saw nothing, only the oppressive darkness. But as the episodes continued, he began to see shadowy figures creeping toward him from the corners of the room. They had no distinct features, just tall, indistinct forms, like living shadows, but he could sense their intent. He knew, with every fiber of his being, that they wanted to harm him. During one particularly terrifying episode, a shadow figure crouched on his chest, pressing down so hard he thought he would suffocate. He could hear it breathing, soft, raspy breaths just inches from his face. The experience left him shaken to his core, and though the episodes eventually stopped, the memory of those figures has never left him. Many who experience sleep paralysis describe the same sensation. The shadow figures that visit them are not random hallucinations, but something far darker, far more sinister. They don't just appear, they linger, their presence thick with malice, as if they feed on the fear and helplessness of their victims. In the late 1990s, a man in Norway reported repeated encounters with shadow people during sleep paralysis episodes. He had never heard of the phenomenon before, nor had he any history of sleep disorders. Yet, almost every night for months, he would wake up to the same horrific scene. Frozen in his bed, he could see 3 shadowy figures standing at the foot of his bed, watching him. They didn't move at first, but as the weeks passed, they grew bolder. One night, he felt one of the figures lean over him, its face, if it had a face, just inches from his. It whispered something in a language he didn't understand, but the message was clear. He was not alone. The encounters became so frequent and so terrifying that he eventually sought help from a doctor, only to be told that he was likely suffering from sleep paralysis. But that explanation didn't satisfy him. The shadows were too real, their intent too malevolent. He knew they were more than just tricks of the mind. In 2014, a woman in Mexico City experienced an episode of sleep paralysis so terrifying that it left her afraid to sleep for weeks. She woke in the early hours of the morning, unable to move. The room was deathly quiet, but something felt wrong. She sensed it before she saw it, a dark figure looming at the foot of her bed. It was tall, with long, spindly limbs, and it seemed to pulse with darkness. As it moved closer, the air grew cold, and the woman felt an overwhelming sense of dread. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure leaned down until it was inches from her face, and though it had no eyes, she could feel it staring into her soul. She described the sensation as one of pure, unfiltered evil. It wasn't just watching her, it wanted her. After what felt like hours, the figure disappeared, and she was able to move again, but the memory of that night has haunted her ever since. There is something about the shadow figures seen during sleep paralysis that sets them apart from ordinary nightmares. They feel too real, their presence too heavy to be mere figments of the imagination. Many who experience these encounters report feeling as though the figures are aware, sentient, and waiting for something, perhaps the moment of ultimate vulnerability when fear has fully taken hold. Modern science may explain sleep paralysis as a disconnect between the mind and body during sleep, a temporary state where the dream world bleeds into reality. But for those who have experienced the suffocating presence of shadow figures in the night, no explanation is comforting. The shadows are real. They are not bound by the confines of the mind, and their intent, whatever it may be, is far from benign. For those who have been visited by these dark figures, sleep is no longer a refuge. It is a battlefield where the lines between the real and the unreal blur, and where shadowy entities wait, lurking in the corners of the night, ready to strike when you are most defenseless. Whether they are mere hallucinations or something far more sinister, one thing is certain: the terror they inspire is all too real. Chapter 4. Shadow Figures in Folklore and History. The shadows have always been more than mere absence of light. Across time, cultures, and continents, stories of dark, malevolent figures lurking in the shadows have haunted human consciousness. These figures appear in ancient texts, legends, and religious accounts, often portrayed as harbingers of doom or sinister spirits with the ability to cross between worlds. The modern-day phenomenon of shadow people, those dark, featureless figures that so many report seeing, seems to echo these ancient tales, as if they've always been with us, waiting in the dark corners of human history. In ancient Egypt, the shadow, or Ka, was thought to be an integral part of a person's soul, capable of existing independently after death. Though Ka was not malevolent, Egyptian texts speak of darker spirits that inhabited the shadow world, demons who lurked in the darkness, waiting to torment the living. One story tells of a figure known as Apep, the serpent of chaos, who was said to embody the primal force of darkness. Depicted in ancient murals and papyrus scrolls, Apep was often shown as a shadowy figure with no clear form, devouring the sun in an eternal battle against the light. To the Egyptians, this battle between darkness and light was not just a myth, but a representation of their daily struggle to keep the forces of darkness at bay. Centuries later, in medieval Europe, shadowy entities became entwined with beliefs about demons and evil spirits. During the witch hunts of the 16th and 17th centuries, it was commonly believed that demons could assume the form of shadows or black figures, stalking their prey before possessing or tormenting them. These shadow figures were often described in trial accounts as dark, human-like shapes that would appear in the periphery of one's vision, disappearing as soon as they were confronted. One such account from a 1603 trial in England tells of a woman who awoke in the night to find a shadowy figure standing at the foot of her bed. She described it as tall and cloaked in darkness, its face obscured, but with a palpable sense of malevolence. The woman believed the figure to be a demon sent to curse her, a belief that was shared by many during that time. The Islamic world, too, has a long history of shadowy figures within its religious and cultural texts. In Islam, jinn are supernatural beings made of smokeless fire, often described as invisible entities who can take on various forms, including shadow-like figures. Many Muslims who have experienced shadow people sightings believe they are encountering jinn. In 2009, a man in Morocco shared his terrifying experience of waking in the middle of the night to find a dark figure standing near his bedroom window. He described the figure as tall and cloaked in black, its features indistinguishable. Frozen with fear, he could do nothing but watch as the figure seemed to hover closer before vanishing into thin air. His immediate thought was that this was a jinn, an ancient belief passed down through generations. He sought out an imam for protection, convinced that the shadowy being would return unless it was banished. In the folklore of the Caribbean, shadowy figures are often associated with the duppy, a malevolent spirit believed to be the soul of the dead returning to torment the living. Duppies are thought to lurk in dark places, especially in trees or the shadows of old buildings. In Jamaica, There are countless stories of people encountering these shadowy spirits at night, often when they're alone and vulnerable. In one documented account from 1978, a woman described seeing a shadow figure while walking home from a late-night church service. As she passed an old cotton tree, she noticed a tall, black figure standing under its branches. At first, she thought it was a man, but as she drew closer, the figure didn't move. It was unnaturally still, and yet she felt its eyes on her, watching. She hurried past, feeling a deep sense of unease, and when she looked back, the figure had vanished. She later told her family that she believed she had seen a duppy, a common belief in her village. Even in Native American traditions, shadow figures are not uncommon. The Cherokees speak of a dark spirit known as the Raven Mocker, a witch who takes the form of a shadowy figure and steals the lives of the elderly or sick. The presence of a raven mocker was said to be accompanied by a sense of overwhelming dread and the sound of rushing winds. While not directly related to the modern shadow people phenomenon, the raven mocker shares the same ominous characteristics, a dark, ethereal presence that feeds on fear and vulnerability. In Hindu beliefs, Rahu, a shadowy deity associated with darkness and eclipses, is depicted as a demon who swallows the sun and moon, casting the world into shadow. Rahu's influence was thought to bring about moments of chaos, confusion, and fear, an idea that resonates with the experiences of many who have encountered shadow people today. In one account from 2011, a woman in India described waking up to find a shadowy figure standing by her bedside. She believed the figure to be an incarnation of Rahu, come to steal her peace and bring darkness into her life. The fear she felt was so overwhelming that she turned to religious rituals to cleanse her home and rid herself of the dark presence. These stories of shadow figures from different cultures share common elements. The figures are dark, featureless, and often associated with fear, death, or misfortune. They appear in moments of vulnerability, when people are asleep, alone, or near death. The idea of shadow people as demonic or malevolent entities has persisted for centuries, suggesting that the fear they inspire is deeply rooted in the human psyche. But it's not just ancient history and folklore that speak of shadow figures. In the 20th century, some psychiatric professionals began documenting cases where patients reported seeing shadowy figures during psychotic breaks or episodes of extreme anxiety. One such case, from a 1967 psychiatric journal, tells of a man who repeatedly saw a black, shadowy figure standing in the corner of his hospital room. The figure, he claimed, had no face but seemed to mock him, growing larger and more oppressive with each sighting. Though the doctors diagnosed him with schizophrenia, the man insisted that the figure was real, a manifestation of something evil that followed him wherever he went. The line between folklore, religion, and psychology blurs when it comes to shadow figures. Whether seen as ancient spirits, demons, or hallucinations, these dark entities have haunted humanity for centuries. And while their origins may differ across cultures, the fear they provoke remains universal. Today's sightings of shadow people, dark, faceless figures that loom in the night, are eerily similar to the spirits of old. Perhaps they are the same beings, appearing in different forms throughout history, always lurking at the edges of our awareness, waiting to step out of the shadows. Chapter 5. Encounters in high-stress situations. There is a certain darkness that only comes during moments of profound stress, a darkness that feels alive, watching, waiting just out of sight. For many, these moments of emotional trauma or life-threatening events bring not just fear, but a glimpse of something far more terrifying. Shadow people, figures that seem to manifest in the height of one's vulnerability. These shadowy entities creep into hospital rooms, linger in the corners of emergency situations, and stalk those standing on the edge of despair. The following testimonies paint a chilling picture of how these figures seem to thrive on heightened emotional states, feeding on terror when people are at their weakest. In 2011, a man named Robert was hospitalized after a severe car accident left him immobilized and in critical condition. He spent days in the intensive care unit, drifting in and out of consciousness, his body fighting to heal. But it wasn't the physical pain that haunted him. It was something else, something much darker. During the long, sleepless nights in the hospital, Robert began to notice a figure standing near the door of his room. At first, he assumed it was one of the nurses checking on him, but when he tried to call out, he realized that no sound escaped his lips. He was paralyzed, not from the injuries, but from something else, an overwhelming sense of dread. The figure, tall and faceless, remained motionless, watching him. It never came closer, but its presence was suffocating, filling the room with a cold, oppressive energy. The worst part, Robert later recounted, was a feeling that the figure was waiting for him to die, as if it was drawn to the edge between life and death. It visited him every night until his condition stabilized, and then it was gone, leaving Robert with the unsettling belief that the shadow had been something more than a hallucination, a visitor from the other side. Robert's experience is not unique. Hospitals, with their sterile halls and constant hum of machines, seem to attract these shadowy figures, especially in moments of crisis. Nurses, doctors, and patients have all reported seeing them, silent observers, standing at the foot of beds or lurking in the corners of dimly lit rooms. One particularly unnerving case occurred in 1997 when a nurse in a New York hospital reported seeing a shadow figure while caring for a terminally ill patient. The patient had been unresponsive for days, hovering between life and death, when the nurse saw a dark figure standing beside the bed. It had no discernible features, just a tall, shadowy outline. The nurse froze, watching in horror as the figure seemed to lean over the patient, as if whispering something inaudible. Moments later, the patient passed away. Shaken, the nurse told her colleagues, but no one could explain what she had seen. Some dismissed it as stress-induced hallucination, but the nurse couldn't shake the feeling that the shadow figure had been waiting for the patient's final breath. Shadow figures also appear during times of intense personal crisis, as if drawn to the emotional turmoil of those on the verge of breaking. In 2003, a woman named Maria was going through a bitter divorce. The stress and anxiety had taken a toll on her, and she often found herself unable to sleep, plagued by nightmares of dark figures chasing her through endless corridors. But it wasn't until one particularly bad night that she saw the figure in real life, or what she believed to be real life. She woke suddenly, her heart racing, only to find a shadowy figure standing at the foot of her bed. It was tall, featureless, and seemed to blend into the darkness of the room, but its presence was overwhelming. Maria tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, but she felt its malevolent intent, as if it was feeding off her fear. She remained paralyzed, her eyes locked on the shadow until, after what felt like an eternity, it slowly dissolved into the darkness. The encounter left her shaken, and though she questioned her sanity, the experience was too vivid, too real to dismiss as a dream. Another witness, a soldier named Mark, encountered a shadow figure during one of the most traumatic moments of his life. In 2008, while stationed in Afghanistan, Mark and his squad were caught in an ambush that left several of his comrades dead. The chaos and violence of the attack pushed him to the brink of collapse, and it was in the aftermath, while waiting for evacuation, that Mark saw the figure. Sitting alone in the dark, his weapon clutched tightly in his hands, he noticed movement out of the corner of his eye. When he turned, he saw a shadowy figure standing a few feet away, just beyond the light of the campfire. It had no face, no features, just a tall black outline. At first, he thought it was one of the other soldiers, but when he called out, there was no response. The figure remained still, watching him, and a deep sense of unease settled over him. Mark later described the feeling as one of impending doom, as if the figure was a harbinger of death. The next morning, when he told his squad mates, they dismissed it as a trick of the light or the result of the trauma he had experienced. But Mark knew what he saw, and the memory of that shadowy figure followed him long after he left the battlefield. In moments of extreme emotional stress, the mind is stretched to its limits, and it's often in these moments that shadow figures make their appearance. Whether they are manifestations of the mind's inner turmoil or something more sinister, these encounters leave lasting impressions on those who experience them. A woman named Angela, who had battled severe depression for years, recalled seeing a shadow figure during one of her darkest moments. It was a night when she had nearly given up hope, the weight of her despair pressing down on her like a physical force. As she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, she saw the shadowy figure standing in the doorway. It didn't move, didn't speak, but its presence was suffocating, as if it were the embodiment of her hopelessness. The next morning, Angela sought help, convinced that the figure had come for her in her moment of weakness. These shadow people seemed to thrive on fear, trauma, and emotional distress, appearing when people are at their most vulnerable. Whether in hospital rooms, battlefields, or during personal crises, these dark figures materialize when the walls between our reality and something darker seem to thin. For those who see them, the experience is unforgettable, leaving a chilling sense that in our most desperate moments, we are never truly alone in the darkness. Chapter 6: Investigations and Paranormal Research. Shadow people have long been subjects of fascination, not only for those unfortunate enough to encounter them, but also for paranormal researchers trying to peel back the layers of darkness surrounding these entities. While sightings have been reported for centuries, it wasn't until the rise of modern paranormal investigation that serious attempts were made to understand what shadow people truly are. Yet, despite extensive research and numerous documented cases, the mystery remains intact. What investigators have uncovered only adds to the eerie aura surrounding these figures, dark presences that seem to defy explanation, evading both reason and capture. In 2002, paranormal investigator Heidi Hollis coined the term shadow people to describe these dark, fleeting figures that so many had already reported. Hollis, who had been studying the phenomenon for years, collected dozens of testimonies from witnesses all over the world, each describing similar encounters. The unmistakable silhouette of a human form, dark as midnight, without facial features or distinguishing details. Her work sparked renewed interest in the paranormal community, leading to more formal investigations into what these entities might be. One of the most chilling documented investigations comes from the New England Center for Paranormal Research. In 2008, a family in rural Massachusetts contacted the center after multiple members of the household reported seeing shadowy figures moving through their home at night. The sightings were not fleeting, nor were they confined to a single person's imagination. These figures seemed to be seen by nearly everyone in the house, including the children, who often woke up screaming about the dark man standing at the foot of their beds. The paranormal team, led by seasoned investigator Sarah Jones, set up infrared cameras and motion detectors throughout the house, hoping to capture some evidence of these elusive entities. On the second night of their investigation, one of the cameras in the children's bedroom recorded what appeared to be a dark shape crossing the room in a single frame before disappearing. It was not a human figure in the traditional sense. There were no defined edges or limbs, just an amorphous, shadowy form that seemed to shift as it moved. The family described feeling an overwhelming sense of dread whenever the shadow figures appeared, but no direct harm ever came to them. After months of investigation, the team concluded that while they had captured something unexplained, they were no closer to understanding what these figures were or why they seemed drawn to the house. The case remains open to this day, a chilling reminder of how little we truly know about these beings. Other researchers have tried different approaches, using technology and ritual in an attempt to communicate with or even banish shadow people. In 2015, the Ohio Paranormal Society took on a particularly disturbing case involving a man named Greg, who had been tormented by shadow figures for nearly a decade. Greg, a veteran of the Iraq War, first encountered the shadow beings shortly after returning home from his deployment. At first, they were only glimpses, fleeting shadows darting out of the corner of his eye. But as time went on, the figures became more pronounced, more present. They no longer lingered in the periphery, but stood at the end of his hallway or loomed over his bed at night. Desperate for answers, Greg contacted the Ohio Paranormal Society, who dispatched a team of investigators to his home. Armed with high-tech gear, thermal cameras, electromagnetic field detectors, and digital recorders, The team hoped to capture evidence of these shadow entities. Over the course of several nights, they recorded fluctuations in the electromagnetic field and, on 2 occasions, captured what appeared to be faint shadowy forms on their thermal cameras. These forms moved in ways that seemed unnatural, slipping in and out of rooms with no discernible physical presence. Despite these findings, the team could offer Greg little in the way of comfort. The shadow people were there, they confirmed, but why they chose to torment him and how to rid his home of them remained a mystery. Some researchers have turned to religious or spiritual practices in their attempts to banish shadow figures. In a particularly harrowing case from 2017, a woman named Angela in Arizona sought out the help of a local shaman after experiencing years of nightly visitations by shadow people. Angela reported feeling watched at all hours of the day, but it was at night that the figures grew bolder. They would appear in her bedroom, hovering silently at the edges of the room. Sometimes they would move closer, standing beside her bed, their dark forms absorbing all the light around them. Angela was convinced that these figures were not just specters of her imagination, but malevolent entities intent on harming her. The shaman performed a traditional cleansing ritual in Angela's home, burning sage and calling upon protective spirits to drive out the darkness. According to the shaman, shadow figures are often tied to negative energy, drawn to places where fear, trauma, or suffering have left a mark. During the ritual, Angela claimed to have seen the figures retreat, slipping into the walls and dissolving into nothingness. For several weeks after the ritual, the shadow people seemed to vanish, but the sense of relief was short-lived. The figures returned, this time more menacing than before. Their presence now felt during the day as well as at night. The shaman performed additional rituals, but to no avail. Angela eventually moved, abandoning the home entirely, convinced that the shadow figures were not bound to a place, but to her. The Rhine Research Center, one of the most respected organizations in the field of parapsychology, has also delved into the shadow people phenomenon. Though primarily focused on studying extrasensory perception and other forms of psychic phenomena, the center has received numerous reports of shadow figure sightings over the years. In one case from 2012, a woman named Rachel came to the center after experiencing what she described as repeated psychic attacks from a shadow figure. Rachel, a self-professed clairvoyant, believed that the figure was more than just an apparition. It was an entity with the ability to affect her mentally and emotionally. During their investigation, researchers at the Rhine Center documented Rachel's experiences, but struggled to provide any concrete evidence or explanation. Rachel's case remains unresolved, another file in the long list of shadow people encounters that defy logical understanding. Despite years of investigations, thousands of eyewitness accounts, and the use of advanced technology, paranormal researchers are still at a loss when it comes to explaining shadow people. Are they figments of the human mind, conjured by stress, fear, and trauma? Or are they real, malevolent entities that have always lurked at the edges of our perception, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves? The truth remains elusive, hidden in the shadows. Chapter 7. Personal Hauntings, Living with the Shadow People. For most, shadow people are fleeting, terrifying visitors, shapes that lurk in the dark corners of the night before disappearing with the dawn. But for others, these entities are not so easily dismissed. Some have lived with these shadowy figures for years, their presence becoming a part of daily life, an ever-present weight that cannot be explained or banished. These are the stories of those who have endured long-term hauntings by shadow people, where fear and dread have settled into the fabric of their lives. In 2013, a woman named Jennifer from Oregon began experiencing what she called daily visitations by shadow figures. At first, they appeared sporadically, always at night. She would wake up with a suffocating sense that someone was in her room, only to see the familiar silhouette of a dark figure standing by her bed. It never moved, it never made a sound, but its presence was heavy, oppressive. Jennifer could feel it watching her, though it had no eyes. What began as infrequent sightings soon became a nightly ordeal. By 2015, the figures, there were now more than one, started appearing during the day. They would stand at the end of the hallway, linger in the kitchen, or hover at the edges of her vision as she went about her life. The most disturbing aspect, she said, was how indifferent they seemed to her growing terror. They didn't care that she was scared. They just were always there, always watching. Jennifer's attempts to get help proved fruitless. Friends and family dismissed the figures as figments of her imagination, blaming her stress, exhaustion, or even mental health. She went to doctors, psychiatrists, and even clergy, all of whom gave her answers that didn't satisfy the creeping sense of dread that had become a constant in her life. She tried everything, burning sage, chanting prayers, and even setting up cameras around her home, but the shadow people remained. And so did her fear. One night in 2016, Jennifer woke to find a shadow figure standing inches from her face, closer than it had ever been before. She was paralyzed, not from sleep, but from sheer terror. She could feel it looming over her, as if it were finally acknowledging her presence. She never screamed. She couldn't. When it finally receded back into the darkness, Jennifer was left shaking, her heart pounding in her chest. That night she decided to move. But even after leaving her home, the shadow figures continued to follow her. They had become a part of her life, silent, uninvited guests that had no intention of leaving. Jennifer's story is unsettling, but not uncommon. For many, the presence of shadow people becomes a lingering torment. In 2009, Daniel, a man from Texas, began to see shadow figures after moving into a new home. Unlike Jennifer's experience, Daniel's shadow figure appeared only at night, standing in the corner of his bedroom. But it wasn't its shape that terrified him, it was its eyes. Unlike the faceless shadows many describe, this figure had glowing red eyes that bore into him from the darkness. Daniel would wake in the middle of the night, his body frozen with fear, to find the figure staring at him, its eyes burning like embers in the blackness. At first, he believed it was a nightmare. But after months of waking to the same sight, Daniel realized this was no dream. He tried to rationalize it, telling himself it was a trick of the mind, a product of stress or sleep deprivation. But the red-eyed figure remained. Desperate for answers, Daniel reached out to paranormal investigators, hoping someone could help him understand what was happening. Investigators came and went, some offering explanations that did little to ease his mind. The figure, they said, was likely a residual haunting, a shadow of energy tied to the house, rather than a sentient being. But Daniel wasn't convinced. The eyes, he insisted, were too real, too filled with intent. He began sleeping with the lights on, hoping to keep the figure at bay. But no matter how brightly his room was lit, the shadow figure always returned, its glowing eyes cutting through the darkness. Other stories are just as unnerving. In 2017, a family in California reported living with a shadow figure that seemed to be attached to their youngest son, Ethan. The family first noticed the figure when Ethan, only 6 at the time, began speaking of the dark man who visited him at night. Like many parents, they initially brushed off his claims as childhood imagination. But when they began seeing the figure themselves, their skepticism vanished. The dark man, as Ethan called him, was a tall, faceless shadow that stood in the doorway of his room, watching silently. It never entered the room, never came closer, but its presence was undeniable. Even their pets, normally calm, would growl and bark at the figure when it appeared. The family tried everything to rid their home of the dark man, cleansing rituals, religious blessings, even moving Ethan to a different bedroom, but nothing worked. The shadow figure remained, haunting their nights, feeding their growing unease. Over time, they became accustomed to its presence, though the fear never truly went away. Ethan, now older, still remembers the figure vividly, though it no longer appears as frequently. The family has learned to live with the unsettling reality that they are not alone in their home. For some, the psychological and emotional toll of living with shadow people is profound. In 2010, a man named Alex from London reported experiencing a shadow figure that would appear every time he entered his bathroom. It started with fleeting glimpses, a dark shape in the mirror, just out of sight, but soon escalated into full-blown manifestations. The figure, always standing just behind him in the reflection, became a nightly occurrence. Alex stopped using the bathroom mirror altogether, unable to face the figure that now seemed to mock him from the other side of the glass. He began to suffer from severe anxiety, dreading the nightly encounter and the feeling of being constantly watched. He eventually sought therapy, convinced that he was losing his mind. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the feeling that the shadow figure was real, lurking just beyond the veil of his perception. For those who live with shadow people, the experience is not one of quick terror, but of prolonged, creeping dread. The figures become part of their daily lives, constant and uninvited companions. There is no escape, no exorcism that seems to work. For these individuals, the shadow people are not fleeting visitors in the night. They are permanent residents, always watching, always waiting. And for them, the question remains, why do these beings linger, and what do they want? In the end, there are no answers, only the enduring fear that whatever these shadowy entities are, they are not going anywhere. As you've now seen, the shadow people phenomenon is far more than just a trick of the mind. It's a terrifying reality for countless individuals. But what about you? Have you ever felt the presence of something watching from the darkness, just out of reach? If so, you're not alone. We want to hear your stories. Share your experiences, your encounters, and join the growing conversation about these mysterious beings lurking in the shadows.